Welcome back to Manly Matters. Glad you're here with me today. Let me first and foremost say, if you're a repeat customer and you saw my last video, I mentioned that I'd have an interview up hopefully sometime this week. It's on the schedules for this weekend. So hopefully I will have it up sometime at the beginning of the week. And also I have another interview scheduled for next weekend. Both of these guys are awesome. I'm really looking forward to talking with them. They're going to be great. But the reason we're here today, are millennials less manly than previous generations? So there was a study done at British Columbia University that asked men how they felt they ranked in masculinity from 0 to 5. They asked different age groups, and these are the breakdown of the results. This study shows that millennials themselves feel that they're less masculine or less manly than previous generations. And that says a whole lot in and of itself. But is it true? So for the next couple of minutes, let's operate under the assumption that it is true and maybe get to the bottom of why it is. Let's dive into a little bit of psychology. So there's a famous psychologist named Erik Erikson, which is a great name if you ask me. He broke down the psychology of the different developmental stages in human beings, starting from birth all the way to death. So I want to break down 3 really important ones in what I'll call the formulation of manhood. The second stage was from ages 18 months to about 3 years. He called this phase autonomy versus shame. So this is the stage where kids need to learn to be trusted. They need to learn to go out on their own and explore and to fail. And there's 2 main ways that parenting at this age can go wrong. If children are criticized too often at this age, they'll become insecure and they'll kind of recluse into themselves. But also, if you're the helicopter parent who is protecting the child at every turn and not letting them be free to explore and free to fail, you'll also create this false sense of security and the safety net within your children. So the third stage is ages 3 through 5, and it's called initiative versus guilt. So this is the age that kids learn to socialize and how to lead and how to follow. Too much control at this point, or you overly criticize or you marginalize your child at this point, it'll build a guilt system within this child. Now, learning guilt at this age is good. That's what they should learn. However, too much of it will lead to antisocial behavior and insecurities. So the fourth stage is ages 5 through 12, and it's called industry versus inferiority. These are the ages where kids begin to learn pride in themselves and self-worth. So at this age, reinforcement and encouragement builds competence and confidence. No encouragement builds laziness and apathy. And failure is once again very important at this age because it teaches competence, modesty, and humbleness. Now, why did I give this Psych 101 lesson? It's basically to explain maybe where some of the parenting went wrong in millennials' upbringing. So video games have been around for previous generations, but they've been much more prevalent in the millennial generation. And I'm not one of those video games are bad people. I play video games myself, but too much of anything is bad. And one thing we know about kids is they have no self-control. So video games have been shown to create shallow relationships that are strictly goal-oriented. They also don't give kids the ability to operate in the real world. So social media is a new phenomenon that the millennials had to grow up with. As adults, we can kind of operate within the social media world. However, children aren't so well equipped. Studies have shown that it creates insecurity and inferiority within younger kids. Also, too much time on social media and you're missing out on real world interactions. It's easy to communicate on social media or via text, but it's a lot harder to have to look someone in the face and tell them something difficult. You don't have to deal with the fear or the sadness or the anger or these different emotions that are invoked in a real truthful conversation. It's so much easier to send a text. Let's keep in mind that millennials are the first generation to grow up in the participation trophy era. If you want to complain about millennials being entitled, well, look at the fact that they got rewards for failing. Also, many millennials grew up being told they are perfect the way they are, and they can grow up to do anything they want to do. So there's a fancy psychological term called cognitive dissonance, which basically means when something you believe is being shown to be not true. And that happens in millennials when they're shown that all these things they're told about being perfect and great and be just the way you are isn't good enough. So it also kind of goes to millennials are the first generation to grow up with the internet. I know I talked about social media, but the internet as a whole gave millennials access to the entirety of everything at a very young age. That created this mentality of instant gratification, and at a young age, you don't know how to deal with that, and you don't know how to differentiate between the real world and that. What we do know is it's still being studied that the effects of the internet and social media and things like that, what it actually has on children. So a study published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology studied the testosterone levels of the different generations. Maybe surprisingly, millennials have lower testosterone than previous generations. In some areas, it was as much as 17% less. Now, what I can say is that maybe millennials are just redefining manliness. There was a study done of different men in different age groups on what they value most and what traits they consider the most manly. The number one trait that millennials claimed was manly was selflessness. Millennials showed that they valued cooperation over autonomy. That was different in the generations before us. Another one was social engagement was rated significantly higher than other generations. Another one to point out specifically was intellectual strength was considered much more highly valued than physical strength. Another study done by the Pew Research Center showed that millennials' priorities in order were number one, being a good parent, and number two, having a successful marriage. So what does that all mean? There's just a disconnect in understanding. But I've got to go ahead and clear this up. Generations are completely made up. So much so, the Census Bureau doesn't define them and doesn't recognize them. Generations are just a lens that we look at people through. The only thing everybody in a generation has in common is that they were born around the same time. Which leads me to another point. All the millennials that are being complained about grew up around the same time, which means we had parents that were roughly in the same age, aka generation. So, if you are complaining about a generation below you, instead of complaining about them, look around to your generation, because your generation raised that generation. And it's also important to note that every generation complains about the one right behind them. Generation X, you were the yuppie generation. You guys didn't know how to work hard. All you knew how to do was put on a suit and tie and go to the corporate world. Baby boomers, the silent generation, said you guys were entitled and had the whole world handed to you and you didn't know how to deal with it. But you can even go back in time to ancient philosophers and they complained about the next generation. Which brings us back to our first question. Are millennials less manly? You want to look at nothing but the stereotypes and you want to see what Time magazine posts about us? Yes, we are less manly. Or if your values just directly disagree with the things that our generation value, also, yes, you will consider us less manly. Don't lump someone into a stereotype just because of the year they were born. It doesn't make any sense. Yes, one generation may be known for something and it may not be known for something else, but ultimately it was just because they were born at that specific time. Society dictates what a generation is known for, and ironically enough, what a generation is known for is typically dictated by the generations before them. If you want to say this generation is whiny and entitled and all this kind of stuff, they're just living in the world that was created by the generations before them. So maybe rather than putting the blame on them, look around. Millennials are not less manly than the generation before them, which is not less manly than the generation before them, and so on and so on. Because ultimately, manliness is defined by a society, and it's defined by the individual. Is there a lesson to be learned here? I don't know. But what I can say is, if you don't like your generation, don't raise your kids how your parents raised you, I guess. And if you don't like the generation below you, don't complain because the generation before you complained about you. With all that being said, I can't wait to see what my generation is going to complain about the next generation. I think they're calling them Generation Z or something like that. But ultimately, as men, we need to find more common ground than we need to find differences, because that's how we build ourselves up. Thank you for giving me a few minutes of your time. If you like this video and you haven't subscribed already, hit the subscribe button. Also, turn on notifications. Look out for the next video. Hopefully, it'll be out at the beginning of the week. And see you next time. Adios.